Forward TV. The world is thinking.
And in many ways, that economic reform period from the 90s onwards led to a huge social change, which may not have been intentional, but was a kind of spin-off as the state retreated from many areas of life in terms of controlling people's lives through the work unit. Suddenly people were forced to buy their own homes outside their work unit, to live separately from all the people they'd worked with, which was quite a new thing in the cities. And it meant that China, people began to have much more space in their day-to-day lives. And so you could say that, to me, during the past 20 years or so, China has gone through many of the social changes that Western societies went through in the 40 years after World War II, compressed and accelerated at an enormous rate. So you've had a sort of consumer revolution, a sexual revolution, you've had the rise of the teenager and youth culture as something distinct. You've had this amazing urbanization that Sheila talked to. And it means that the young generation in particular are growing up in an extremely different era. Think about teenagers now, 18-year-olds. They weren't even born in 1989, So they've grown up in a very, very different world. And I think that it's generally agreed that there's a much greater sense of sort of independence among the young generation. There have been some surveys which have shown that in the average Chinese urban nuclear family, in any conversation, 48% of the time is dominated by the one child. 20% by each parent and sort of 5% by the grandparents if they're lucky. And I think a lot of older people do feel quite left behind by the way that society has been turned on its head. Particularly, we've had this physical urbanization, modernization, where old neighborhoods have suddenly been replaced by high-rises. Young people are much more at home, perhaps, in these kind of, the shopping centers of Shanghai. But a lot of old people who who see their grandchildren getting their first job after school or university and earning, 5 times or 10 times more than the older generation ever earned in their lives, and really feel that they're on the scrap heap, particularly because a lot of them lost their education in the Cultural Revolution. So you've got all kinds of generation gaps. I think some older people feel fairly bitter, and particularly those who've watched state enterprises privatized and, the bosses doing quite well out of it. So in some senses, I feel that you can say China really has gone through some of the same sort of ideological disillusionment that the Eastern Bloc countries went through after 1989. But, at the same time as they've gone through this, everybody has been constantly told that they are still communists and that it is still a socialist country. So the government, I think, realized a few years ago that there's a real ideological gap. And people were rushing into religion, into various strange cults and, all kinds of different belief systems that sprang up or reappeared in the 90s. In the past few years, I think we've seen the government make a very concerted effort to keep up with what young people think. And I had a rather strange experience last year where I went to this animation festival in Hangzhou, which is not far from Shanghai. And it was basically all about that kind of Japanese anime cartoon style of youth culture. And there was a lot of money to be made because there was a trade fair too, and they're doing a lot of animation. But you had government leaders sitting on a grandstand while there was a big parade of people dressed up as sort of grapes and various, underwater cartoon characters, as sci-fi warriors in gold body armor with blue wigs and silver-plated submachine guns. And then the man from the State Administration of Radio, Film and TV got up and said, this is a very useful contribution to socialist spiritual civilization. But when you went into the exhibition, you could see what he meant, because there were computer games and trendy modern animation based on things like the Long March or young Chinese soldiers fighting the Japanese in the 1930s. So they were using it to push a kind of patriotic message and to keep up with a young generation which has much more diverse interests. And I think the government is, becoming quite clever in this respect.